introduction. Bill Witte is the founder, chairman, and CEO of Related California. Since 1989, Mr. Witte has been responsible for the strategic direction and overall management of the firm, which has encompassed the planning, financing, and construction of a development portfolio of 16,000 residential units, totaling more than $6 billion in assets. Prior to Related California, Mr. Witte previously served as a leading housing executive in the public sector, with 10 years at the City of San Francisco, where he served directly under Mayors Art Agnos and Dianne Feinstein, the Department of Housing and Urban Development in Washington, D.C., the National Association of Housing and Redevelopment, and the Office of Housing and Community Development in Philadelphia. Mr. Witte graduated from the University of Pennsylvania with a bachelor's degree in urban studies and a master's degree in city planning. He currently sits on the boards of several educational and philanthropic organizations, such as the Lusk Center at USC, although we can forgive him for that, the Graduate School of Design at the University of Pennsylvania, the Fisher Center at UC Berkeley, the Orange County Human Relations Group, and the Shelter Partnership, a nonprofit organization devoted to solving homelessness in Los Angeles. Would everyone please join me in giving a warm welcome to Mr. Bill Witte. Okay, that's a little loud.
I'm digitally challenged. How do you turn this on? Okay.
How do we turn it down? Somebody out here that can help?
We have it.
You got it? Okay. Good. Thank you so much for joining us. Is there any way to get rid of that? Thanks so much for joining us. Really excited to talk to you. We're going to have a great discussion about real estate, about California. That wasn't me, guys, I promise. About real estate, about California, about your career. And I thought we'd just kind of jump into it. Perhaps you could just get started about telling us how you got started in real estate, your first job, how that came about, and
Well, I didn't start out that way. This goes back many decades, but my parents were both from New York City. My father was from the Bronx, my mother was from Brooklyn. I ultimately grew up in the suburbs, but was always exposed to the city at an early age. And I knew at a young age that I wanted to do something with cities. I had no idea what. And back in the day, working for government was like okay. It was like not a terrible thing to do. So I only wanted to go to college in a city. So I ended up at the University of Pennsylvania, which is definitely in a city. I was an urban studies major when all that meant was you kind of hung out for 4 years and toured neighborhoods. And actually that's not such a good thing. It should have been more rigorous, but it was interesting. I then got a master's in city planning only because it still had to do with cities. And I really had I didn't even know what was out there then. From there, I got a job in City Hall in Philadelphia. This is before most of you were born. When a guy named Frank Rizzo was mayor, who was the former police chief. In Philadelphia, there's just no analog to California. I don't know if any of you saw a movie, what was it called? Something Hustle. It was about the Abscam scandal. And a lot of it was in Philadelphia. So I went from the ivory tower into the trenches very quickly. Philadelphia, when I worked there, had 25,000 abandoned housing units. There's no such thing in California. People live in garages here. Very different, gritty, old industrial, fading city. But it was a good experience anyway. Went to Washington, D.C., worked for a National Housing Trade Association, and got a break when the last year of the Carter administration, I was just a kid, I was hired to be an executive assistant to the Federal Housing Commissioner at HUD because with only 10 months left in the administration, they couldn't get anybody. Nobody would take that job with any experience. And I remember the Federal Housing Commissioner was a home builder from Staten Island named Larry Simons. And the interview was, I don't know you, they tell me you're good, I hope it works out. But it was a very, we had to deal with the White House a lot, not the most able White House probably. It demystified a lot of things to me, and it was all about, that was the peak of the federal Section 8 program. Hundreds of thousands of units got developed all over the country, and there was no greater political chit than getting a Section 8 contract. It was a very lucrative program. So it was a good experience, and I was on the firing line, so I had to learn fast. A month before the election, newly elected San Francisco Mayor Dianne Feinstein calls Larry, because then Washington had all the money. I know that seems like a faraway time. So presumably mattered and said, I need a housing person. Do you have any suggestions? And he turned to 6 of us and said, anyone know anyone who'd want to work for, I was single at the time, and I thought, he called her, he's very loyal, so I had just the right person for you. And that really got me the job. I mean, I did have an interview, but so I went out cold. And in those days, we were talking about this earlier, people rarely left their region. I mean, even Ivy League schools, California kids didn't go, it was just a different time. People were it was much more parochial time. But I took a risk, went out there, didn't know anybody. She was a very demanding boss. Every Monday morning, there was a staff meeting. Every department head in the city, health, building, police, fire, housing, everybody in that office on Monday morning, unless you were excused. And she had her book out, and she's still that way, I think. But she was very results oriented, so it was good. And you were forced, you either delivered or you were going to hear about it. And towards the end of her second term, I knew I don't want to be in government any longer. I'm a little frustrated. I'm mostly a referee. We did financing programs for housing throughout the city. But the newly elected mayor, Art Agnos, who was a very progressive, Diane was much more moderate, but I knew him some, and he asked me to stay on as a deputy mayor. I said, I will for a short period, and I did for 18 months, whereupon my brother, who had, with another partner, had met Steve Ross, the chairman of the related companies in New York, to do office development in California. And Related, interestingly, now it's this mega developer, started in the 70s as a developer of HUD-assisted housing. That's Related's roots. Now they're doing Hudson Yards and Time Warner Center, but they were a HUD developer originally. Always did affordable housing, so he said, you know anyone, who, I might work with out here. He said, you ought to meet my brother. Same interview. We had the interview, and he says to me, I don't know if you know what you're doing, but you sound good, so let's try. So at first it was just me, and the first project we got involved in was right here in LA, the first West Coast redevelopment of a public housing site called Normont Terrace in Harbor City, right at Vermont and Coast Highway, right down the hill from Palos Verdes, a wartime era 400-unit low-income public housing project. We were going to redevelop the whole thing, and neither we nor the housing authority really knew how this was going to happen. Eventually, we got through it. We own the 400 low-income replacement units today, 22 years later. We built 224 for-sale condos, 400 replacement low-income units. The most challenging project I ever worked on. And it was touch and go, but we got it done. And after that, kind of took off, got into market rate housing. What I lacked, and I regret it, because I went from a sort of quasi-political role, nominally in real estate, to running housing. I jumped over the project manager, get your hands dirty, learn the ropes. And then I had to learn on the job 10 or 12 years later. I've hired well, and it worked out. But that was not helpful. I don't advocate that. That just happened to be, things worked out for me. But initially, especially when it was just I was alone, I had no staff, it was a bit of a challenge, dealing with contractors and architects and The public sector, you can be a referee, as I said. Private sector, there is kind of a bottom line, or at least there's supposed to be. Anyway, so what's worked out and why I still love what I'm doing is we now have offices in Irvine, Los Angeles, and San Francisco. We didn't have a physical office in San Francisco until 8 years ago. We're now the most active developer in San Francisco. So it's all kind of worked out, and we have an affordable housing division that does work all over the state, including in LA, that does 100% affordable housing. And it ranges from, we've done 4 public housing redevelopments, 2 in LA, a recent one was in Boyle Heights over the First Street Bridge, the old Aliso Village project, now called Pueblo del Sol, which we still own, 1 in East Oakland and 1 in San Francisco, and we're working on a big one in San Francisco right now. We're doing a big homeless project with the Weingart Center in Skid Row in LA. We just opened a project with West Angeles Community Development Corp in the Crenshaw District. But we're also doing the Grand Avenue project with Frank Gehry in downtown LA. We did the Century 40-story high-rise condo project in Century City. Probably our most successful project involved both components. In Santa Monica, I think we opened now 7 years ago, called Ocean Avenue South, 158 luxury condos on Ocean Avenue, right up from shutters at the beach, that sold for $1,700 a square foot, and 160 low-income family rentals right in between the 2 condo buildings, which we still own and manage, on a 99-year prepaid lease, and it was condos. And we were nervous. I didn't know if that was going to work. And it was hugely successful at every level. Both our Pueblo del Sol project in Boyle Heights and the Santa Monica project won Urban Land Institute Global Awards of Excellence, which is kind of the highest award you can get in the development world. You usually don't make money when you win an award, but we actually did. We've just finished, or about to finish, 1,300 units of high-rise and mid-rise, 20% affordable luxury apartment projects in San Francisco. 2 other sites in San Francisco we're working on. We did 118 unit, 18-story high-rise called the Argyle in Hollywood, right by the Capitol Records building, which has done very well. We are working on a site in Santa Monica now with Vaughn's Supermarket at 7th and Lincoln. We'll eventually buy the site, build them a bigger new Vaughn's, and build 300 apartments above them, 25% of which will be affordable. But we've also been one of the largest affordable housing developers in San Bernardino County and Orange County. So it's kind of a full spectrum of things, and that's been very exciting for me.
I'm very curious about, well, a number of things you said, but one of the things you said was about the fact that the public sector was a little bit demonized back then. And I think when I read about you, I noticed you said that a lot of it was due to the Reagan administration at the time. I think his inaugural address, he said, the worst thing is the government showing up at your door and saying, what can I do for you? Right? The idea is you should be able to do it yourself. The government's not the solution to everything. So it sounds like he really, the president at the time, really set the platform, the stage for the zeitgeist, the way people were thinking about real estate and development then. I'm curious, how do you think Trump has perhaps influenced the youth, those who are getting into real estate today, whether positively or negatively, the way Reagan did, in the 80s?
If there's anything positive about it, it's lost on me. But I will say this, one thing I'll say about Reagan, he certainly, government developed a bad reputation that it probably had somewhat earned, I have to say, over the years. But Reagan also in 1987 negotiated with the Democrat of Chicago, Dan Rostenkowski, who was chairman of the Ways and Means Committee, and did tax reform. That would never happen today, not possible. And so whatever you may think of them, that was a very different era. And to some degree, I think in the country, you kind of get what you deserve. I mean, I hate to put it that way. So yes, it's a very different time. It's a much more cynical time. It's a much more somebody in the San Francisco Board of Supervisors once said to me of the then, by San Francisco standards, very moderate Dianne Feinstein. She said, you know, my constituency, kind of a Bernie Sanders constituency, they say Diane's bought and paid for by the business community. And I say, this is the progressive saying, no, she actually agrees with them. I don't agree with her, but she legitimately believes that. That's the problem, is that you can't disagree, because if you disagree and you are on the other side, you're corrupt. You're an idiot. You can't possibly have a different opinion. And we see that now at every level of government. And I find that kind of disheartening, although I think eventually we'll hopefully grow out of this.
Bring me back to California for a sec. You came here, you know, when Dianne Feinstein told Larry Simmons, and then he brought you out here. How has this sort of attitude towards development changed since then? Has it improved? I can't imagine it having improved, to be honest, but I'm curious kind of how
Well,
it's
first
evolved.
of all, I don't know the exact figures, but the population of California has what? Doubled, more than that, since the 1980. There's pros to that, and there's a lot of cons. I mean, people tell me, well, you know all of this, you know, this world-class public education system, then there's Prop 13, now all of a sudden it's terrible. I mean, you know, the public services have certainly been strained. There's more density. There is a misallocation of resources and infrastructure and things of that nature. And I think the public, perhaps without thinking about it, says, wait a minute, things aren't good. There's too much traffic, there's this, we haven't kept up. That, of course, has infected the views of development. And, you know, in LA and San Jose, to take two cities, they've imposed what they call housing impact fees. In other words, housing has to pay for housing. And I thought to myself, wait a minute. I think job growth creates housing demand. Housing doesn't create housing demand, but okay. In other words, people are flailing. They're flailing. And you look at the homeless thing. I heard a very interesting statistic this morning at Lusk Center, Brand X, but a study that was a very econometric study, and it looked at how much of the homeless problem anywhere really, let alone in California, is due to housing affordability as opposed to other factors. And what they did is they took the average rent of an apartment in the United States and measured it against the average rent in LA, which is way higher. And they did what economists do and did regression analysis or whatever, and concluded that 1/3 of the homeless population is due to housing affordability. Now, that's a big number, but it's also telling that 2/3 isn't. In other words, in theory, if rents were what they are in Dallas, you'd still have 2/3 of the home. Now, that's not an exact science. It just shows you how complicated these things are. So when people criticize the city of LA's response to homeless, something I know a little bit about, some of the criticism is warranted, but not all of it. I mean, I'm in this world. We have one permanent supportive housing with the homeless project in East Hollywood that we did, I don't know, 10 years ago. I don't have a magic bullet. I could sit here and, oh, you should do this and do that. It's just very complicated. So it gets back to government. Government is not held in high repute for all the reasons we've discussed. Now you've got development, which is the reaction in LA in particular to, for those of you who've heard about it, a bill in the state legislature that has failed twice, 3 times, SB 50 from San Francisco State Senator Scott Wiener, which would have allowed higher density. It was ratcheted back in its most recent version around transit stops. UCLA professor Zev Yaroslavsky, personal friend of mine, who I really like, goes apoplectic of it. Just, oh my God, they're going to build Manhattan in Westwood. And it's like, no, Zev, I don't think that's going to, but it's such a fraught issue. And what I've had to learn in development, and you all who are in development need to think about, is you can't, just like you don't like being demonized as a developer, you can't demonize people who oppose you. not always, but often, they have a point. There's too much traffic. There's, it's complicated. It's not easy. And the reaction, the dual reaction, poll after poll shows homeless housing, lack of housing, affordable housing, the biggest issue in the state. But still to this day, especially in suburban areas, they don't want to do it. The worst place in the state, Marin County, North San Francisco, is also the most liberal politically. Really? I mean, that's the world we're in. And because it's such a big state, because it's like 4 states really, cross-cutting state legislation for development, for housing, whatever, is very challenging. It's so hard to get a consensus. I've often said that the solutions you're going to see, the creativity is going to come from the local level. It's not going to come from the state level. The state trying to provide some money. It's never going to happen. It's too big a state, too difficult to have a one-size-fits-all solution.
Basically, a lot of what you're referring to is NIMBYism, right? I'm curious, how do you I think, like you said, you have to look at the opposing side. They have fair points, right? And I think I agree with you. There's something to be said about those who want to keep communities the way they are. California is so attractive because of the low-rise architecture, the way we value sunshine. We don't want skyscrapers here. Naturally, that is a factor, at least 1/3 in the statistic that you read, that causes homelessness and causes the housing stock to really be constrained. So I'm curious, how do you reconcile the two? How do you create housing while keeping the urban design intact in a way?
Well, first of all, developers complain about rules, but we really like rules. And LA, much more so than the Bay Area cities, has not done a good job of having rules. And I'll give you some examples, because to get to that, LA has traditionally been the province of 15 quasi-independent council people. And because the districts are so large and land use is so important, they like being their own planning commission. It's human nature. You can criticize, but it's always kind of been that way and still kind of is. So both developers get frustrated because what are the rules? Well, I don't know. Go talk to the council, go to the planning department and say, well, have you talked to the council office? And neighborhood groups get frustrated. You agree with something, where'd that come from? Who said you could do that? Oh, well, so-and-so said if I did this, he'd approve. I mean, San Francisco, over the past 15 years, or 20 years, rezoned the whole eastern part of the city, which was largely non-residential or undeveloped, from the Trans Bay neighborhood in Rincon Hill downtown, all the way south, eastern neighborhoods, all the way down to Hunters Point in that area. And there are rules. And to some degree, even in San Francisco, if you abide by the rules, you can get a project approved. It all takes too long because of the State Environmental Quality Act, which is a California-specific thing, but there are rules. And the only way I think you can make a dent is reach an agreement on rules. Now, the City of LA tried to do that in Hollywood when Eric Garcetti was the councilman. And they actually, I thought, did a pretty good job. They met with groups, and there was going to be more density, and it was here versus there, and people could, there was sort of a rhyme and reason. But they screwed up the environmental impact report. An activist challenged it and won, and they threw it out. And now, somewhat back to square one. I mean, they're trying. So there has to be a way at a neighborhood scale or council district scale to establish rules so that both neighbors and developers or investors have a sense of the rules. You saw there were 2 ballot measures in LA, 2 years ago? The first one, I don't think either was good, but they centered around the idea that if you need any discretionary approval, you'd have to go to the ballot, unless the first one that passed, you meet various labor standards and affordable housing requirements. Any discretionary approval. This is a city that has no rules. Everything's a discretionary approval, almost, versus existing zoning. The second one by the AIDS Foundation's Michael Weinstein, our most prolific balloteer, I would say, would have gone much further. Like, you just can't do it. Fortunately, he overreached, as he did on Prop 10 last year, and it failed pretty largely. But that's what's happened. This is a state where things can go to the ballot. Is that really what we want? We want to make it happen. Why even have a planning commission? Why just go to the ballot? Now, another thing in development. If you're a large developer like Related, you can weather some time. It may not be great. If you're a small developer, no way.
Can I pause you right there?
Yeah.
So you're a large developer, you can weather the times, but we're very late in the cycle. How does a big company like Related mitigate the risk of a recession? I don't know what type of debt the company gets. Is it short term? Is it long term? Are you worried about the market crashing like it did?
Well, I'll tell you what we're doing. First of all, any developer, including any of you in this room who say they know when the recession's coming, is lying. I go to all the UCLA, USC, Berkeley real estate conferences, and they're very esteemed economists.
Just one of them is actually the only esteemed one.
No. Okay, whatever. And they always joke every year how wrong they were because it's so hard to tell. There's so many exogenous variables, et cetera. So all I can say that we do, we are long-term owners. We're not merchant builders. We typically don't sell. So that maybe not quite as sensitive to time issues, but for example, we are not under construction on anything right now, but we have the Hollywoods, we have the Santa Monica site, we have 2 sites in San Francisco, and we recently signed a term sheet with 3 families that own a 42-acre shopping center adjacent to South Coast Plaza on the Costa Mesa Santa Ana border to develop 2,000 apartments over time. Each of these is going to require a 2 to 3 year entitlement. None of them require taking down land. We'll spend a lot of pre-development money, but we don't have to pay for land. Probably we wouldn't do that today. We did that in 2 of our San Francisco properties, but at an earlier time in the cycle. Now, that doesn't protect you from a recession, but at least, one other thing we do periodically, it was true of our Santa Monica site, frankly, it was true of Hudson Yards and Time Warner Center in New York. They're publicly owned sites. You don't take down land. Usually, Grand Avenue for us was an exception. We'll never do that again until you're ready. So you still have cost risk, but not that much. That's about the best we can do. The other thing is as a long-term owner, we try to design kind of a higher end product that will still be competitive 10 years from now. You never really know, but again, we're not selling in 2 years. So that's not sort of anti-recession, that's long-term planning.
What do you think about the recently passed?
And we use our own money for pre-development.
Okay.
So we're not borrowing, we use internal capital for pre-development.
Commercial leases, though, are pre-leased. Residential aren't. So if you're performing rents, even though you're using your own pre-development money, if you're developing, what happens if rents go down by 10%?
Related, even in New York, has typically not been a standalone office developer. Hudson Yards already has 5 million square feet of office as part of a master development, but the first 2 buildings and the office in Time Warner Center were fee deals where the anchor tenant bought the space. And that was done to activate an area, bring people to an area for residential, retail, and other things. Hudson Yards, the office is doing so much better than the residential. There's going to be more office there probably. But so to your question though, it's usually only in a mixed use setting that we'll do office. I'm trying to think, somewhere along the way they may have done a spec office building. We do have a huge project in Santa Clara right opposite the 49ers football stadium. 240-acre public golf course, again, a public site, you don't have to take down land, fully entitled. We're going to start construction this year on ultimately 9 million square feet. First phase, about 3 million square feet, and there is significant office there. Oh, that's it. Son of a gun. So, you're right, it's a different business. You know, a lot of the commercial real estate players at scale now are REITs, they're public companies. And we don't usually or can't compete with them, but they don't like long entitlements. They don't like these public-private deals. Kind of, there aren't that many developers that are both large enough and private who can work on things like this
That gives you a competitive advantage.
in that space,
Right.
not everywhere.
This project right here, you just said it yourself, 9 million square feet, nearly 1,700 residential units. Are you worried about overflooding the market with supply?
Well, if it were only the 1,700 units surrounded by all that space, and you probably can't envision this, there are so many jobs within a 5-minute drive of here, it's stunning, and nothing else. However, across the street, right, let's see, there's the stadium. Well, right that way, there's a low-rise business park called the Tasman East area, which has been rezoned for residential. We have 1,300 more units there, and we're about to start on the first 540. They won't all come online at once, and there's a huge amount. There's 10 million square feet of office under construction in Silicon Valley, and 70% of it is pre-leased. It's a stunning figure when you think about it. Now, who knows how long that will go on. So we're a little, yes, we're always trying to reinvent the newest, better product to distinguish yourself, because again, we're not merchant builders. And there are a lot of major players up here. So you try to distinguish. We're doing the first high-rise or type 1 concrete apartment building other than in Mountain View in Silicon Valley in this site. So we'll see. But yeah, it's a question, it's a risk.
Let's talk politics. Mentioned Trump a bit. What do you think would happen if Bernie won? How would that affect real estate?
So I was telling Daniel earlier that my partner, our chairman, Steve Ross, said to me, I think it was in the first George Bush administration, he said, I care who the president is, but I mostly care that one party doesn't have the presidency in both houses of Congress, because then only so much harm can be done. That's kind of true if you want to look at it cynically. So, you know, who knows? I mean, I don't think he will be elected president. There would be an immediate, I think, it would be interesting to see what the markets did. You know, the Democrats are not likely going to control both houses of Congress. So to some degree, I think investors will say, well, what can he do? I mean, yes, it's not good for investment, but what can he really do? I mean, you know, it's new turf. We haven't really experienced it. Everybody has veered toward the middle. Even Reagan, for all the, you know, the Republicans like to lionize him as the great conservative. One of his great skills, both as governor and as president, is that he would make deals. He was conservative in some respects, but willing to make deals, especially on things like immigration. We don't have that today.
What do you think? What do you think is in the political realm? What do you think will happen? Let's say if, you know, the cynical idea of, you know, Bernie and the entire Democratic Party get both control of Congress, of the House and Senate.
The chance of that happening or the likelihood of me playing in the NBA. So I don't think about that too often.
We talked a lot about the private sector, the public sector. Which, and I think I know the answer already, and I'm sure everybody will like to hear it in this audience, but I'll ask it anyways. Which do you think is a more effective means of bringing down housing costs and making it more affordable for the population? The private sector, the free market, creating new housing stock, or using, you know, public subsidies like the low-income housing tax credit program, or, you know, the dirty word of rent control, right? Which of the two do you think is actually a more effective means?
Well, I don't think it's a binary choice. what can government really do? They can control land use, which I think is by far the biggest issue, even more than subsidies, even though affordable housing requires subsidies. They can control land use. An example, the governor announced early on, after he got elected, that all surplus state sites would be made available for affordable housing. We did that 3 times under Diane as mayor in San Francisco. Surplus public sites, we converted to affordable housing. They're not going to move the needle, but they're things that, and zoning, dare I say it. Land use is huge, and it's been a big problem, needless to say, in California. So without the private sector, you will not move the needle. If you don't care, that's okay. If you want to move the needle, you're going to have the private sector. What works best is giving inducements then to provide affordable or mixed income. We're the biggest developer of mixed income housing in the state, but we only do it where affordable housing is required. It's giving away too much if you're the only one doing it and nobody else has to. So, where it works best is where they work together. And I know that's a difficult thing because of the politics of it. I will say that, especially given the cost, which is a whole nother issue, especially in coastal California, of developing housing, without significant public money, you will not even make a dent. And the governor is throwing more and more money at it. I will say, and I have to say this, there's not the follow-through. There's great policies and programs. And once again, government is involved there. So I keep coming back to state money, local initiative. City of LA on homelessness, which you're probably aware of, passed 3 years ago $1.2 billion homeless bond. Santa Clara County passed a $900 million affordable housing bond 2 years ago. Alameda County passed a $670 million bond. San Francisco passed a $600 million bond. You're going to see more and more initiatives happen at the local and county level. That's just a fact. Whether they can be paired with land use, I don't know. I'm working with Mayor Breed in San Francisco now on a ballot measure that the Board of Supervisors, for reasons that elude me, will not support, so she has to get signatures to get it on, that would expedite approval of either 100% affordable housing, teacher housing, or mixed income housing where you exceed the inclusionary housing requirement by 15%. So 20% affordable becomes 23% affordable. You have to go to the ballot for that. Why? I mean, that's what you're up against. In an allegedly progressive liberal city, even that's a heavy lift. So without government paving the way, I'll give you another example. We just finished, or almost finished, a project in San Francisco at the corner of Mission and South Van Ness. 550 high-rise apartments, and then we sold half the site to the city and then fee built for them a 450,000 square foot office building for Department of Public Works, Building Department, Planning Department. City was our partner, no opposition, none. 20% affordable housing, so 110 low-income units in that building. Took 3 years to get approved. That's the best you can do for a big building. Partly because of the State Environmental Quality Act, you got to do an EIR, they're backed up, they don't get to it. We got to do better than that. In Seattle, which has some of the similar dynamics as coastal California, tech-driven economy, Microsoft, Amazon, they produced, I think, 3 housing units for every new job. In San Francisco, the most aggressive it's ever been, it's 12 to 1. Or maybe it's the reverse. Whatever it is, we're worse. We got to do better than that, or I don't care what policies you pass. If you can't do better on the time it takes, you hear a lot about that, about the homeless thing, which is true. It's a problem there too. I cannot understand why we can't do better. It is a source of great frustration for all of us.
We've talked a lot about LA and San Francisco. Let's talk more about LA. For the audience at least, what submarket do you think presents the most opportunity for growth in the city of LA? And then I'm going to ask you, beyond LA, across California.
That's a good question. The places that would generate the highest returns are the places like most of West LA where it's hardest to build. The places that have most encouraged development have been downtown, where it's almost, from a developer standpoint, almost overbuilt, and Hollywood. And those were conscious decisions, frankly. They were old redevelopment areas. It was a conscious decision. But where's the greatest opportunity? Typically, you would look at, and this is kind of a dangerous word in a room of progressives, which I assume this isn't entirely. You'd look at gentrifying neighborhoods. You'd look at where's the next Brooklyn. Carmel Partners is doing 1,000 units sort of on the edge of the Crenshaw district. It's I don't know how to define the neighborhood. West of West Adams, north of Crenshaw, 1,000 units. There was nothing there. So if you follow what I would call gentrifying type neighborhoods, I hate to use that label because it implies negativity, like we're going to displace people. It's probably where the greatest room for growth is. There are target areas, much like Playa Vista was 10 years ago or whatever, now largely built out. There are, I don't know why I would say area, but like what we're doing, we're not the only ones doing this, but what we're doing with the supermarket in Santa Monica. Look at current underdeveloped commercial sites. There are old malls, for example, where they're still going to be malls, but they have acres of parking, opportunity to redevelop those. Supermarkets sitting on a valuable site where there's value. Now, again, it's all about zoning. It's all about how much you can build. You would probably look east of Hollywood now, which hasn't completely taken off, that could, where land isn't grossly overvalued. The Arts District, it's already happened, frankly, kind of. Chinatown, there is growth. These are usually areas where it's also slightly easier to get approved. Having said that, you try to do that in Boyle Heights and you're going to get, the gentrification thing will be all over you. So you have to be smart about it. There's no set rule.
Beyond LA, where in California do you think presents most opportunity?
Well, first of all, you have to look at different categories. We have a funny business model because we do high-end and affordable, but not that much in the middle. But there's been huge growth, mostly in warehouses in the Inland Empire, where we've developed a lot of low-income housing. So if you were, I hate labels, but I would say a lower-end market-rate apartment developer, I'd be looking all over western San Bernardino County. There's been plenty of growth there. Rancho Cucamonga, and then getting into Montclair, those areas. I don't know what's available, but some of those are right on the Metro rail line, which is a good thing. There's a lot of job growth out there, but that's more modest scale stuff. That's not high density. Density is great, but the greatest friend of neighborhoods in opposing density is cost. To build high rise, it's really expensive. That's only going to work with really high rents. It's simply not going to work anywhere else. And so there's almost 3 tiers, at least in the apartment world of development, sort of the lowest scale, more moderate, and then the really high-end stuff. So it's always about jobs. It's always about jobs. So where are jobs? Well, unfortunately in LA, for the most part, the biggest job growth has been on the West Side. At least the tech job growth, which is in Hollywood. Entertainment, tech. That's where you should have the most housing, but I'm not sure you can get the most housing there.
Got it. Let's bring it back to Los Angeles. And then I want to just with one last question, and then I want to open it up to the audience. The Grand Avenue project, or it's just called the Grand, I guess. Curious to hear your thoughts a little bit about that. I'm sure a lot of people want to know a little bit about it. 39 stories, 175,000 square feet of retail, 400 luxury residences, 20% affordable, and then Equinox Hotel. I wonder why.
Well,
maybe you could just tell us,
So,
how we got started.
so the brief history is around 2000, in fact, when Dick Reardon was still mayor, Eli Broad went to him and said, on Bunker Hill, you've got 3 city blocks that are just sitting there, and they've been there for years. And he had just come off helping to finance a Disney concert hall. And he convinced the city and the county, who were normally mortal enemies, to form a joint powers authority. So the city council person who represented downtown, the county board of supervisors member who represented downtown, head of the redevelopment agency, and the chief executive officer of LA County were on this joint powers authority. They actually got together, they did a request for proposals, it came down to us and Forest City, and we won, if what we got was winning. That was 15 years ago. And that was at a time, 2004, the sky was the limit. Anything was possible. We started out, well, okay, we'll use Frank Gehry for one building, because Eli said, oh, you gotta use Frank. He did Disney Construction. Yeah, one building. Well, Frank is good at this. Well, but the knee bone's connected to the thigh bone, and next thing you know, he's doing the whole project. So we spent 3 years negotiating a deal, and then the recession hit, so it just kind of put on ice. We're coming out of the recession, and the first thing that happened was Eli, those of you in LA may recall, was looking for a place to build a museum to house a lot of his art collection. And Beverly Hills and Santa Monica were offering him the store, but he wanted to be in the cultural corridor. So he had a history with LACMA. He wanted to be somewhere on Grand Avenue. So Grand Avenue was 3 sites. There's the site we're now building across from Disney Concert Hall, and then Kitty Corner, where his museum is, was a second site. The third phase was just to the east, which is now a parking lot owned by the county, of the Gehry site. So he negotiated. We didn't have anything we could do, and he got us to agree to relinquish our development rights for the site that became his museum. Of course, he paid for that. The city then went to us and said, what would it take for you guys to do something on the rest of that site? They said, well, some subsidies, because we had to do 20% affordable housing. So the redevelopment agency gave us $15 million. We ultimately built the Emerson, a 20-story, 20% affordable apartment tower, sort of across from the museum with a restaurant on the ground floor. Eli effectively paid for the building to house OTM Restaurant, which is at the back of that site. We had this little park in between. So that became the first phase of the project. Meanwhile, we struggled. This is at a time when Related has already financed the beginnings of Hudson Yard. I don't want to be immodest about my partners, but they can finance almost anything. Grand Avenue was the hardest. Not for political reasons. The economics were challenging. Why were they challenging? First of all, it was a series of Gehry buildings, and they're more rational than a lot of his buildings from a design point of view, but it's expensive. Second, if you look around the city, most high-rises built building by building. You build this building, then you build this building, then you build that building. This is building the whole block at once over one parking structure. So your interest carry is huge because you're carrying the entire block as you build. And you're taking more risk. Also, it's going to be an amazing project from an urban design point of view. It's a 12,000 square foot public plaza, which the redevelopment agency helped pay for. 75,000 feet of retail. Of course, the retail world has changed. Retail usually means food. I mean, you can call it retail because technically it is. Related's actually pretty good at that, though, I'll say. Hotel. First, we had the Mandarin Oriental Hotel, who was in our Time Warner Center project. Then we determined it's too expensive. It just it's not Beverly Hills, it's downtown. I don't care how nice it is. Related started, the principals of Related, as you probably read somewhere along the way, bought an interest in 2006 in Equinox, which then bought SoulCycle. And then 5 years ago, got the first idea of starting an Equinox hotel brand. And so we could have gone to any hotel, but they've built the first one in Hudson Yards. We're doing one in San Francisco, in LA, one we may do in Honolulu. There's 4 or 5 other sites. I was skeptical of the concept, and I would invite you, if you happen to be in New York, to check out the Hudson Yards Hotel. It's kind of a 4-star plus. It has some of the Ace Hotel allure, coolness, but higher end finishes, great common area. I think it's going to do very well. And in any event, so there's a hotel, 435 units of housing, and because we always looked at this as the highest end location in downtown. Whether that's true or not, that's how we've underwritten it. So this 435, it's 35-story tower. We have a 20% affordable tax-exempt bond finance component of 300-something units. And then same building, we have a tier of condominium designed luxury rentals, like a premium tier of rentals. And the rental market we've seen with our Hollywood and West Side projects has changed some. More and more people are willing to pay really high rents. Some of them are pied-à-terres, some of them, so we think it'll do well, but given how long we've been at it and the cost, I don't know how profitable it will be. I think it will do well, if you can understand the distinction I'm making. The third site we've pretty much let go, because the county said, well, unless you're prepared to do something now, what are we, stupid? I mean, come on, we haven't even built this yet. County is not really a real estate arm of government. It's a little challenging to work with them as a development arm. So that's kind of just there still. So we'll see. I mean, I think we're optimistic that it will be a beautiful project and it will do well. From a purely economic developer point of view, it probably won't be our most profitable project, but good for the brand, as we like to say.
Okay, well, thank you so much, Bill. Maybe we can do we have a few minutes for questions. So yeah, just opening it up. Feel free. This guy's pretty eager. Go ahead.
So, going into second and third tier cities, the cost of construction is the same whether you do a 9th tier city or a 2nd tier city, and the lenders are not willing to recognize the income stream to justify the financing.
It's very interesting you should raise that, because we've had 2 senior executive meetings in New York about, not California per se, but should we Related be expanding into Boise, Denver, Austin, Nashville, Charlotte? I hesitate to call them 2nd tier, smaller cities that are doing well. The reality is, it's a completely different cost structure, way less. But first of all, there are plenty of people there. Our model of do the highest end product in the sub-market, the most expensive, I'm not sure how well it translates. Maybe eventually it would. Now, what we're planning in Santa Ana, maybe is a California version. It's not high rise. You know, it's 5-6-story wood frame. It's not Grand Avenue. We like to think it'll be the nicest Orange County product, so we are looking at it that way. There is a big cost difference. Different subcontractors, not as unionized, but so is the rent structure different. And the sweet spot is finding that place where, you know, cap rates are higher in these locations, where you can get a good return by doing good product, but where you can, for us, where we can get a little premium above the existing market. We spent a year studying Portland, Oregon on the market rate side. We looked and the opportunity, we knew people. We ended up not doing some big project up there. Instead, we opened an affordable housing office there. We have 5 affordable projects in Portland now. So we've thought about that question. we just haven't, first of all, we're really busy, and I think to some degree, at least for us, you stick what you're good at. You can't be good at everything. At those more cost-driven markets, you typically are owner-builders because it takes some of the air out of the balloon. If you have to hire a third-party general contractor, it's going to cost a little more, less risk. So we haven't been willing to do that yet. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't, but you can only do so much, I think, is the way we look at it.
Can you talk a little bit about the mid-course correction on the grant when Gary was out and somebody else?
Well, actually, Gary was more just dormant. And we were struggling with the costs. We were figuring, how the hell are we ever going to finance this? Remember, you're coming out of the recession, but you're still. And I have to give him credit for this. Our chairman just said, no, we're using him. I'm either going to do that or I'm not going to do it. Because the expectation had been so built up. It's across from Disney Concert Hall. We had, we had Gensler look at it, and they're a perfectly good firm, but it's not Frank Gehry. And said, no, got to be Gehry. And the political process, it's interesting. You look around downtown, even our Emerson's pretty bland building. Not a lot of architectural design winners there. But everybody's hopes and wishes were in Grand Avenue. We were not going to be able to get away with, even if we wanted to, bringing in something other than a world-class architect. That's just the box we were in, and our chairman stated it.
But wasn't there a Gensler design actually
There was.
presented?
There was. It was an informal one. It was never presented for approval. And Supervisor Molina, who chaired from the county, said, no, not good enough. But then so did Steve Ross, so it wasn't going anywhere anyway.
You mentioned Hollywood and downtown LA were the conscious locations, locales of where housing went. I'm just curious, whose consciousness was that? I mean, who do you think was driving that?
So downtown.
This is a Trammell Crow guy.
Oh, I know. We were
putting that out there.
He actually is living in the Emerson right now.
Are you?
My view.
Um,
Not kidding.
So in downtown, there was a conscious decision to try to get development downtown. And the irony, and native Angelenos said, what, downtown? Who would go? Nobody goes there. So there were all sorts of programs instituted to get historic rehab done in the historic core and encourage, you could kind of do whatever you wanted. So developers, being developers, said, I'll go where they let me go, even if that's not, and over time it kind of fed on itself. Hollywood, like part of downtown, had been a redevelopment area. So there was a apparatus in place to encourage development. Even when redevelopment ended, the horse was already a little bit out of the barn. Now, this was before Netflix moved in and all of that, but already, and the red line had opened. So there was, it's transit oriented, or at least as much as LA can be transit oriented. So the government structure literally encouraged development in those areas, downtown in particular. And that's somewhat continued to this day, I think.
So I'm curious your thoughts on, with the rising unaffordability for a lot of people, the promise or not promise of QOZ, qualified opportunity zones, as well as modular construction. Do you think they hold promise for addressing that?
I think the second one does. I don't think the first one does. Related has a fund management business in New York, and they've had 2 opportunity zone funds. And because it's there. Opportunity zones are potentially good for investors. They don't make much difference for developers. It's like slightly cheaper equity, but it's not going to create affordable housing. I can tell you that right now. And there are, the only areas that are getting opportunity zone investment are areas that probably don't need it, that have become opportunity zone. Like, they're not going to South Central LA. which was the idea, if you will, behind the program. Doesn't make much difference on the development side, potentially, although they're taking risk, a very good deal for an investor trying to shield capital gains. Modular, I'm a personal investor in a big modular factory on Mare Island in Vallejo in the Bay Area called Factory OS. And I think it's a great thing potentially for affordable housing. The biggest challenge, apart from capacity, which is still a challenge, is that because the subcontractor world, once the thing comes out of the factory and goes to the site, is so busy, they capture a lot of the savings. They just charge more because they can, because you still need them. So at least in coastal California, that has to be sorted out. But I do think modular, especially for affordable housing, and realistically, it shouldn't be this way, more inland. I mean, where you don't have the same labor costs. You said, Factory OS, by the way, is 100% carpenters union, not the rest other building trades, but at much lower rates than typical union wage rates would be for, framing conventional housing. So I do think modular offers hope. They've got to figure out how to get enough capacity so that they can respond to all the potential demand. It's like a chicken and egg thing.
We have one more question.
One more.
How do you think about some markets that were hit particularly hard in the recession, like Inland Empire? And you mentioned there's job growth. How do you think about hitting a critical mass both in size and diversity so they can sustain, another downturn?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I'm not sure. The recession was more about fake home ownership. People getting $500,000 houses who could afford a $250,000 house. Now it's hard to qualify. So there seems to be things in the system to prevent that from happening, of course, until it happens again. What I don't know is how sustainable all that growth is. Because we've never seen, Amazon building 3 million square feet of space in 3 years, sort of, at not great wages. I'll leave you with the last thought. The most troubling thing to me about all of this stuff, and I say this non-ideologically, is the rising inequality. I don't know what we're going to do about that, but you have growth at the high end and growth at the low end. The middle is squeezed or shrinking. I think that's a real problem. It's a problem for real estate to wrestle with. Inland Empire, could be a semi-quasi solution to part of that, but wages are not high in those warehouses. I don't have an answer. I would just leave you with that, as that issue is only going to worsen, I think, before it gets better. And that's not a Republican versus Democrat thing, it's both. So I think we all need to think about that.
If everyone would join me in thanking